What if I told you that the most powerful telescope ever built just detected something that has physicists questioning everything they thought they knew about the universe's beginning? And what if that discovery brings us closer than ever to answering the oldest question in human history: does God exist? Welcome back to Logic over Spirit, where we tackle the biggest questions at the intersection of reason and belief. I'm your host, and today we're diving into the ultimate showdown: science versus God. Or is it? For centuries, humanity has been caught in what seems like an endless tug of war. On one side, science marches forward with telescopes, particle accelerators, and DNA sequencers, revealing the mechanics of reality. On the other side, billions of people maintain an unshakable faith in something beyond the physical: a divine creator, an intelligent designer, a cosmic mind. But here's what makes this conversation so explosive right now. We're living in an age where science is probing the deepest mysteries of existence. We're studying the first moments after the Big Bang. We're exploring the fine-tuned constants that make life possible, and we're grappling with consciousness itself, that strange inner experience that seems to resist pure materialist explanation. Walk into any university physics department, and you'll find brilliant minds who see the universe as nothing but particles and forces, operating according to blind laws with no purpose or design. Walk into any cathedral, mosque, or temple, and you'll find equally intelligent people who see the fingerprints of divinity everywhere they look. Both groups have their reasons, their evidence, their logic. So who's right? The stakes couldn't be higher. This isn't just academic philosophy. If God exists, then reality has ultimate meaning. Your life has cosmic significance. There's justice beyond this world, hope beyond death, and a relationship with the infinite awaiting you. But if God doesn't exist, then we're the products of blind chance in an indifferent universe, our consciousness a temporary accident, and death the absolute end of our existence. So can science prove God exists? Can it prove God doesn't exist? Or are we asking the wrong question entirely? By the end of this video, you'll understand why this debate is more nuanced, more fascinating, and more relevant than you ever imagined. And fair warning, no matter what you believe right now, some of what we discuss today will challenge you. But that's exactly why you're here, right? Let's begin by understanding what science can and cannot do. Chapter 1. The Limits of Scientific Proof. Before we can ask whether science can prove God, we need to understand something crucial. What does science actually prove, and what are its boundaries? Here's the uncomfortable truth that even scientists will admit: science doesn't actually prove things in the absolute sense. Science deals in models, theories, and probabilities. It's a self-correcting system that builds increasingly accurate descriptions of natural phenomena. Think about how many times scientific consensus has shifted throughout history. For centuries, scientists believed in the geocentric model, with Earth at the center of everything. Then Copernicus showed us we orbit the sun. For generations, physicists believed in the luminiferous ether, an invisible substance that filled space. Then the Michelson-Morley experiment showed it didn't exist. Newton's laws worked brilliantly for 200 years until Einstein showed they were incomplete. Einstein's relativity works brilliantly until we probe quantum scales where it breaks down. This isn't a weakness of science. It's actually its greatest strength. Science is designed to update itself when new evidence emerges. It's humble enough to say we were wrong and change course, but this means that scientific truth is always provisional, always subject to revision based on new data. Science operates through a specific method: observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and peer review. It asks questions that can be tested, measured, and repeated. Can we observe it? Can we quantify it? Can other scientists replicate our results? This is what makes science so powerful. It's grounded in evidence that anyone can verify. But here's where it gets interesting. Science, by its very design, is limited to studying the natural physical world. It measures mass, energy, space, and time. It tracks causes and effects within the universe. Science uses instruments, thermometers, microscopes, telescopes, particle detectors, all tools that interact with physical reality. This means that anything outside the natural realm, anything supernatural, metaphysical, or transcendent, sits beyond science's jurisdiction. It's not that these things don't exist, it's that science, by definition, cannot access them. Science is like a metal detector on a beach. It's brilliant at finding coins and jewelry, but completely useless for finding wooden artifacts or glass. The limitation isn't a flaw. It's inherent to the tool. Think of it this way. Asking science to prove or disprove God is like asking a thermometer to measure love or a microscope to detect justice. These aren't failures of the instruments. They're category errors. The tools simply weren't designed for those questions. Can a telescope tell you whether a painting is beautiful? Can a chemical analysis tell you whether a poem is meaningful? Can physics equations tell you whether an action is moral? Of course not. These questions require different forms of inquiry, aesthetics, literary criticism, ethics. They're real questions with real answers, but science isn't equipped to address them. This doesn't mean questions about God are meaningless. It means they might require different forms of inquiry, philosophy, theology, metaphysics, personal experience, historical investigation. Science can inform these discussions, certainly, but it cannot monopolize them. The philosopher Karl Popper established that for something to be scientific, it must be falsifiable. There must be a possible observation that could prove it wrong. This is a useful criterion for distinguishing science from pseudoscience, but it also reveals science's limitation. Many important questions aren't falsifiable in this narrow sense. Does consciousness exist? You can't falsify that, you directly experience it. Are there objective moral truths? Science can't test that. Does life have meaning? Not a scientific question. So when someone confidently declares that science has disproven God, they're overstepping. They're making a philosophical claim dressed up as a scientific one. And when someone dismisses all scientific findings that challenge their beliefs, they're doing the same thing in reverse, letting their theology dictate their science. The honest position recognizes that science has a domain, the natural world, and questions of ultimate reality might extend beyond it. Science can tell us how the universe works. It cannot tell us why the universe exists or what it means. Science can describe what humans do. It cannot tell us what humans ought to do. These are philosophical questions that require philosophical reasoning. But let's not stop there. Because while science can't prove God in a laboratory, it has uncovered some absolutely stunning patterns in nature that make even skeptical scientists pause and wonder. Patterns that cry out for explanation, patterns that seem to point beyond mere chance or necessity. Which brings us to perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence in this entire discussion. Chapter 2. The Fine-Tuning Mystery. Imagine you're exploring an abandoned house and you find a radio perfectly tuned to a station, playing music. You'd naturally assume someone tuned it, right? You wouldn't think the dials randomly fell into the right position. Now imagine that radio had 10,000 dials, and each one had to be set to a precise value, not roughly close, but exact to within 1 part in a trillion, or else the radio would produce only static. And you find it playing symphonies perfectly. What would you conclude? That someone with incredible precision tuned it, or that it's just an amazing coincidence? This is essentially what physicists have discovered about our universe. It's fine-tuned to a degree that defies easy explanation. And we're not talking about a handful of coincidences. We're talking about dozens of fundamental constants and quantities, each calibrated to allow for the existence of complex structures, chemistry, and life. Let me give you some examples that will absolutely blow your mind. The strong nuclear force, which holds atomic nuclei together, is calibrated to a precision of 1 part in 10 to the 40th power. That's a 1 followed by 40 zeros. If this force were even slightly stronger, only a tiny fraction stronger, no hydrogen would exist in the universe. All the hydrogen would have been converted to heavy elements in the first moments after the Big Bang. Without hydrogen, you have no water, no organic chemistry, no stars that can sustain themselves for billions of years. Life becomes impossible. But what if the strong force were slightly weaker? Then no atoms beyond hydrogen could form. The force wouldn't be strong enough to bind protons and neutrons together into larger nuclei. No carbon, no oxygen, no nitrogen. None of the elements necessary for chemistry and life. Either way, whether too strong or too weak, you get a sterile universe incapable of producing complexity. Then there's the cosmological constant, the energy density of empty space itself. This value is balanced to within 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. Let me repeat that because it's almost incomprehensible. 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. That's not a 1 with 40 zeros. That's a 1 with 120 zeros after it. To put this in perspective, there are only about 10 to the 80 atoms in the observable universe. The precision required for the cosmological constant makes that look like a large number. If this value were even infinitesimally larger, the universe would have expanded so rapidly after the Big Bang that matter could never clump together. No galaxies, no stars, no planets. If it were infinitesimally smaller, the universe would have collapsed back on itself immediately after the Big Bang. Either way, the universe would be completely sterile. Physicist Lee Smolin calculated that the odds of this constant having a life-permitting value by chance are 1 in 10 to the 229th power. These aren't numbers the human mind can really grasp. We're talking about precision so extreme that every physicist who encounters it experiences a sense of profound wonder or deep discomfort. The ratio of electromagnetic force to gravitational force is exactly 1 part in 10 to the 40th power. Why does this matter? If gravity were slightly stronger relative to electromagnetism, stars would burn too hot and too fast. A star like our sun would exhaust its fuel in less than 1 billion years. Not nearly enough time for life to evolve. If gravity were slightly weaker, stars couldn't ignite nuclear fusion at all. No stars, no heat, no light, no life. The mass difference between protons and neutrons seems arbitrary, but it's not. Neutrons are just slightly heavier than protons by about 0.1%. If this ratio were reversed, if protons were heavier, then protons would decay into neutrons throughout the universe. Hydrogen atoms would be unstable. Chemistry as we know it would be impossible. The expansion rate of the early universe is another staggering example. Immediately after the Big Bang, the universe expanded at a specific rate. If the expansion had been slower by even 1 part in 1 billion, gravity would have pulled everything back together within the first second. The universe would have collapsed before stars could form. If the expansion had been faster by 1 part in 1 billion, matter would have been flung apart so rapidly that nothing could gravitationally bind together. No galaxies, no stars, no planets. Physicist Paul Davies called this the most precisely fine-tuned coincidence in all of physics. Cosmologist Roger Penrose calculated that the odds of the universe having the specific low-entropy conditions necessary for life are 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. That's not a typo. That's 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. A number so large it cannot be written out even if every atom in the universe were a digit. There are over 30 of these fundamental constants, and every single one sits in the narrow range that permits complex structures, chemistry, and ultimately life. The strength of the weak nuclear force, the masses of elementary particles, the ratio of the universe's mass to its critical density, the initial conditions of the Big Bang, all precisely calibrated. Change any of them even slightly, and you get a sterile universe. No stars, no planets, no atoms complex enough for chemistry, no possibility of life anywhere ever. So what explains this? Scientists and philosophers have proposed 3 main possibilities, and each one has profound implications. First, pure chance. We won the cosmic lottery. Out of all possible universes with random values for these constants, we just happen to inhabit one of the rare ones where everything aligned perfectly. But when you calculate the odds of all these constants randomly aligning, you get numbers so astronomically small that calling it luck seems absurd. It's like shuffling a deck of cards and getting them in perfect order, not once, but thousands of times in a row. Then doing it again and again. Roger Penrose, one of the most respected physicists alive, said that calling this chance is like believing a hurricane could blow through a junkyard and assemble a fully functional Boeing 747. The probability is so remote that appealing to chance feels like giving up on explanation altogether. Second, the multiverse hypothesis. Maybe there aren't just trillions or quadrillions of universes. Maybe there are infinite universes, each with different physical constants, different laws of physics, different starting conditions. In this vast multiverse, every possible combination exists somewhere. We just happen to inhabit one of the rare universes that allows observers to exist. It's the anthropic principle. We see a fine-tuned universe because if it weren't fine-tuned, we wouldn't be here to observe it. This sounds scientifically sophisticated, but let's think carefully about what it actually proposes. Here's the problem. The multiverse is, by definition, unobservable. These other universes are causally disconnected from ours. We can never detect them, visit them, measure them, or test for their existence. They're not testable or falsifiable. Some critics argue it's not even science, it's metaphysics dressed in mathematical clothing. Physicist Paul Davies, who's no friend of religious explanations, has called the multiverse hypothesis a cop-out. You're trading one thing that requires explanation, fine-tuning, for something that requires even more explanation, an infinite machinery generating endless universes. And where did that machinery come from? What are the laws that govern it? You haven't solved the problem. You've just relocated it. Moreover, the multiverse requires its own fine-tuning. The mechanisms that would generate multiple universes, whether eternal inflation or quantum branching, depend on precisely calibrated laws and constants. You're explaining fine-tuning by invoking something that itself is fine-tuned. It's like explaining a complex machine by saying there's an even more complex machine factory somewhere that we can never visit or verify. And here's the kicker. You're trading one unprovable idea, God, for another unprovable idea, infinite unseen universes. From a purely scientific standpoint, positing trillions of undetectable universes to avoid the implications of one finely tuned universe is hardly more economical. The third possibility? Intentional design. The universe was deliberately calibrated by an intelligent mind with life in mind. For some scientists, this is the most economical explanation. It requires one entity with creative power rather than an infinite number of undetectable universes. It's actually the simpler hypothesis in terms of entities multiplied. When we encounter fine-tuning anywhere else, we recognize it as design. If you found a watch on a beach, you wouldn't assume the waves randomly assembled the gears and springs. If you discovered a message written in the sand, you wouldn't think the tide etched it by accident. When we see multiple independent systems all calibrated to achieve a specific outcome, we infer intention. Now, does fine-tuning prove God? No. Not with absolute certainty. You can always appeal to chance or the multiverse. But it presents a profound question that materialist explanations struggle to answer without invoking speculative concepts that themselves require enormous faith. Even atheist cosmologists have been moved by this evidence. Fred Hoyle, who spent much of his career opposing religious explanations, famously said, "A superintellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal of Britain and an atheist, wrote a book called Just Six Numbers, documenting how 6 fundamental constants must fall within incredibly narrow ranges for life to be possible. He concludes that this demands an explanation, though he prefers the multiverse to God. The fine-tuning argument doesn't close the case, but it certainly opens a fascinating line of evidence. The universe looks like it was expecting us. It was set up with stunning precision to allow for the emergence of complexity, consciousness, and life. And it's not the only evidence pointing in this direction. Chapter 3: The Beginning of Everything. For most of human history, the dominant view among scientists and philosophers was that the universe was eternal. No beginning, no end, just an infinite cosmos existing forever, stretching infinitely into the past and infinitely into the future. This was comfortable for atheists, because an eternal universe needs no creator. If it's always been here, if it just is and always was, why invoke God? The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle argued for an eternal universe. It seemed intuitive. How could something come from nothing? Better to say the universe has always existed. This view persisted through the Enlightenment and well into the 20th century. Even Einstein, when he first developed his equations of general relativity, found that they predicted an expanding or contracting universe, not a static, eternal one. This bothered him so much that he added a fudge factor, the cosmological constant, to force his equations to describe an eternal, static cosmos. Then came 1927. A Belgian priest and physicist named Georges Lemaitre proposed something revolutionary based on Einstein's field equations. The universe had a beginning. He calculated that the universe was expanding, which meant if you ran the clock backward, everything would converge at a single point, a moment when space, time, matter, and energy all came into existence together. A moment of creation. The scientific establishment resisted fiercely. The idea seemed too religious, too much like the book of Genesis, declaring, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Atheist cosmologist Fred Hoyle gave it a mocking name during a BBC radio interview, The Big Bang, trying to make it sound absurd and unscientific. The name stuck, but so did the evidence. Edwin Hubble's observations in 1929 confirmed that galaxies were rushing away from each other. The universe was expanding, just as Lemaitre predicted. If it's expanding now, then it was smaller in the past. Run the clock back far enough, and you reach a beginning. But maybe, some scientists argued, the universe oscillates. It expands, then contracts, then bounces back in a new Big Bang, eternally cycling. This would preserve the comforting idea of an eternal cosmos. But the evidence kept mounting against this. The universe doesn't have enough mass to halt the expansion. It will expand forever, not contract. Then came 1964. Two radio astronomers, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, were trying to eliminate static from a sensitive antenna when they discovered a faint microwave radiation coming from every direction in space. At first they thought it was interference, maybe from pigeon droppings on their equipment. But after cleaning everything, the signal remained. What they'd discovered was the cosmic microwave background radiation, the afterglow of creation itself. The heat signature left over from the Big Bang, now cooled to just a few degrees above absolute zero but still detectable. This was the smoking gun. The universe had a hot, dense beginning. The evidence became overwhelming. Observations of the cosmic microwave background, the abundance of light elements like hydrogen and helium matching Big Bang predictions, the large-scale structure of the universe, all confirmed the same story. The universe is about 13.8 billion years old. It had a beginning, and they lead us directly to our next question. What about the information encoded in every living cell? Even scientists who desperately wanted an eternal universe had to concede. In 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin published a theorem proving that any universe that has been expanding on average throughout its history must have had a beginning. There's no escape. Vilenkin, one of the world's leading cosmologists, concluded, "All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning." Here's why this matters profoundly for our question about God. If the universe had a beginning, it demands an explanation. The most fundamental principle in all of science and philosophy is causality. Every effect has a cause. We never observe something coming from nothing. We never see effects without causes. So what caused the Big Bang? What caused the universe to come into existence? This is where it gets philosophically intense. The universe, by definition, includes all matter, energy, space, and time. These things came into existence at the Big Bang. So the cause of the universe must be outside matter, energy, space, and time. It must transcend the physical universe. Think about what this means. The cause cannot be material because matter came into existence at the beginning. It cannot be bound by time because time itself began at the Big Bang. It must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. It must be powerful enough to bring an entire universe into existence from nothing. And it must be capable of generating the specific initial conditions that led to our universe rather than some other possible universe. These are precisely the attributes that classical theology ascribes to God: a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal being capable of choosing to create. Now, atheist philosophers and scientists have tried various ways to avoid this conclusion. Bertrand Russell famously said, "The universe is just there, and that's all." But this is not an explanation. It's giving up on explanation. It's saying the most fundamental question we can ask, why is there something rather than nothing, has no answer. That's intellectually unsatisfying. Stephen Hawking tried another approach in his book, The Grand Design. He proposed that the universe created itself from nothing, using the law of gravity and quantum mechanics. Because there is a law like gravity, he wrote, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. But critics immediately pointed out the obvious problem. The law of gravity is something, not nothing. Quantum mechanics is something, not nothing. You can't use laws of physics to explain the origin of physics itself. Laws require a universe to operate in. They require space, time, matter, and energy. You can't have quantum fluctuations without a quantum vacuum, and a quantum vacuum is a very specific thing with definite properties governed by physical laws. Philosopher David Albert, reviewing Hawking's book, wrote, "Relativistic quantum field theories describe the fluctuations of fields, which presuppose space and time and matter. These theories absolutely do not tell us where space, time, and matter came from. Some cosmologists propose eternal inflation, where new universes bud off eternally from a parent universe. But the Borda-Guth-Vilenkin theorem shows that even eternal inflation must have had a beginning. You cannot have an infinite regress of past events. The chain of causes must begin somewhere. Others suggest the universe came from a quantum vacuum fluctuation. But a quantum vacuum is not nothing. It's a sea of fluctuating energy governed by quantum laws. Where did the vacuum come from? Where did the laws come from? You're just pushing the question back." The philosopher William Lane Craig has refined what's called the Kalam cosmological argument, which puts the logic simply. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. This is both intuitive and scientifically verified. We never observe exceptions. The universe began to exist. This is now confirmed by overwhelming evidence. Therefore, the universe has a cause. That cause, by logical necessity, must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, enormously powerful, and capable of bringing a universe into existence. These are the attributes that the word God has classically referred to. Now you might object, who created God? But this commits a category error. The argument is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. God, in classical theology, is proposed as the necessary uncaused first cause, a being whose nature is to exist, whose existence is not contingent on anything else. God doesn't begin to exist, so God doesn't need a cause. It's like asking, what does blue taste like? The question applies a category from one domain to something where it doesn't fit. Numbers don't begin to exist, so we don't ask what caused the number 7. If there's a necessary being, by definition, it doesn't begin to exist. Does the Big Bang prove God? Not conclusively. You can always propose alternative explanations, though they tend to be highly speculative and themselves metaphysical. But the beginning of the universe shifts the burden of proof significantly. The default assumption that reality just is, that it's eternal and self-explanatory, no longer holds water. Something brought the cosmos into being. That something possesses attributes traditionally associated with divinity: spaceless, timeless, immaterial, enormously powerful, and capable of free choice in creating. The implications are staggering. Chapter 4. The information in life. Open your phone right now and look at the apps, the operating system, the code running in the background making everything function. Every feature, every function, every pixel that appears on your screen exists because intelligent programmers wrote information into the system. Lines of code, algorithms, data structures, all arranged with purpose and intent. Information doesn't arise by accident. It's always, in every case we've ever observed, the product of a mind. Now consider this. Your DNA contains approximately 3 billion base pairs of genetic information. If you printed it out in standard text format, it would fill thousands of books, enough to fill a small library. This information is stored in a 4-letter chemical alphabet: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, abbreviated as A, T, G, and C, arranged in precise sequences that instruct your cells how to build proteins, regulate metabolism, coordinate, healing, reproduce the entire system, and pass this information to the next generation. But it's not just information. It's coded information, digital information. Your DNA works exactly like computer code. It has a symbolic language where 3-letter words, called codons, specify particular amino acids. The sequence AUG codes for the amino acid methionine, UG codes for tryptophan. There are 64 possible 3-letter combinations in the genetic code, and they map to 20 amino acids plus stop signals. This information is read by molecular machines called ribosomes that decode the genetic instructions and translate them into specific proteins, which then fold into precise 3-dimensional shapes that allow them to perform specific functions in the cell. It's a language, a digital code, more sophisticated than any software humans have created. The complexity is staggering. A single cell contains more information and more sophisticated technology than the most advanced factory on Earth. The bacterial flagellum, a tiny motor that some bacteria use for propulsion, rotates at up to 100,000 RPM, can reverse direction in a quarter turn, and is more efficient than any motor humans have designed. It has a rotor, a stator, a drive shaft, bushings, and a universal joint, all made from proteins assembled according to genetic instructions. Your body contains about 37 trillion cells, and each one is running thousands of precisely coordinated chemical reactions every second, all guided by the information encoded in DNA. Here's the question that haunts the origin of life research. Where did this information come from? In all of human experience, in every case we've ever observed, specified complex information comes from intelligence. Software requires programmers. Books require authors. Blueprints require architects. Instructions require an instructor. We've never, not once, observed specified complex information arising from purely undirected material processes. When we find ancient texts carved in stone, we don't assume erosion randomly created the letters. When we intercept a radio signal from space that shows patterns, SETI scientists would immediately conclude it's from an intelligent source. Information is the hallmark of mind. Yet inside every cell in your body is an information storage and retrieval system that makes our best technology look primitive. The information density of DNA is millions of times greater than the best hard drive we can manufacture. It's 3-dimensional, self-correcting, self-replicating, and has been operating continuously for billions of years. Charles Darwin proposed natural selection as a mechanism for biological change, and it works beautifully for organisms that already exist. Natural selection explains why finches on different islands have different beak shapes, why bacteria develop antibiotic resistance, and why moth populations shift color in polluted environments. These are real, observable processes, but natural selection requires reproduction, and reproduction requires the information system of DNA. Natural selection cannot explain the origin of that system. It's like saying evolution explains how computers improved from the first PC to modern laptops, which it does by analogy, but it doesn't explain how the first computer came to be, how the first chip was designed, how the first code was written. Origin of life researchers have spent decades, billions of dollars, and countless laboratory hours trying to show how the building blocks of life could self-assemble through chemistry alone. They've created amino acids in simulated early Earth conditions. They've synthesized nucleotides. They've demonstrated some chemical self-organization in certain environments. But there's a massive gulf between chemical building blocks and a functioning information system that can store, retrieve, copy, and utilize data. It's the difference between having a pile of letters and having a Shakespeare play. The letters are necessary, but they're nowhere near sufficient. The probability calculations are sobering. Biologist Douglas Axe, who has a PhD from Cambridge and conducted research at the Medical Research Council, calculated that the probability of getting a functional protein of modest length, say 150 amino acids by chance, is about 1 in 10 to the 77th power. To put that in perspective, there are only about 10 to the 65th atoms in our galaxy. Even if every atom in the galaxy were a dice roll happening every second since the Big Bang, you still wouldn't have enough probabilistic resources to generate even one functional protein by chance. And life requires thousands of different functional proteins working together. For a minimal self-replicating organism, you need not just proteins but a genetic system to encode them, a membrane to contain them, metabolic pathways to generate energy, and mechanisms to coordinate everything. The simplest free-living organism we know of, Mycoplasma genitalium, has about 500 genes and over 100,000 base pairs of DNA. All of this has to work together. Take away any major component, and the system collapses. Some scientists appeal to RNA world hypotheses, suggesting that RNA, which can both store information and catalyze reactions, came first. But RNA is itself extremely complex and difficult to form, and no one has shown how you get from random RNA molecules to a self-replicating system with coded information. Others propose metabolism-first scenarios, where simple chemical cycles somehow bootstrap their way to life. But metabolism without inheritance can't evolve, and inheritance without a genetic code doesn't preserve information. The information theorist Hubert Yockey, who applied information theory to molecular biology, concluded after decades of research, the belief that life on Earth resulted from chance is simply a matter of faith. The information contained in life cannot arise spontaneously by natural processes. This isn't an argument from ignorance. It's not saying we don't know how life started, therefore God. It's saying we do know how information arises. It always comes from intelligence. When we find Egyptian hieroglyphics, we don't need to witness the scribe writing them to infer intelligent agency. The information itself is the evidence. The discovery that life is based on information, not just chemistry, but coded instructions organized in a language with syntax and semantics, points toward what we always observe information pointing to: intelligence. Stephen Meyer, who has a PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge, makes this case powerfully in his book, Signature in the Cell. He argues that the information in DNA constitutes strong evidence for an intelligent source. It's not a gap in knowledge that we're invoking God to fill. It's positive evidence of the very thing that minds uniquely produce: information. The origin of life remains one of the most profound unsolved problems in all of science. Every naturalistic proposal faces insurmountable obstacles. The more we learn about the sophistication of even the simplest cells, the more difficult the problem becomes. But wait, a skeptic might say, Maybe information can arise naturally through processes we don't yet understand. Maybe there's some law of self-organization that generates complexity and information, but laws don't generate information. Laws describe regularities. The law of gravity makes apples fall, but it doesn't arrange apples into meaningful patterns. Natural laws explain order, like crystals forming or snowflakes developing symmetry. But they don't explain specified complexity, like a message or a machine. There's a crucial difference between order and information. Ice crystals are highly ordered, but they contain almost no information. DNA is both highly ordered and information-rich. The sequence matters. Change the letters, and you change the meaning, just like changing letters in a sentence changes its meaning. Moreover, we face what's called the combinatorial problem. There are vastly more non-functional sequences than functional ones. For every meaningful English sentence, there are billions of random letter combinations. For every functional protein, there are trillions upon trillions of non-functional amino acid sequences. How does chemistry search this vast space and find the functional ones without guidance? The honest answer from the scientific community is, we don't know. Origin of life research has not produced a plausible naturalistic pathway from non-living chemistry to the first living cell. After 70 years of intensive research, we're not closer to solving this problem. We're more aware of how difficult it is. Yet critics argue that invoking design is giving up on science. Isn't it just God of the gaps? Aren't we pointing to our current ignorance and plugging God into it? But this misunderstands the argument. The design inference isn't based on what we don't know. It's based on what we do know. We know that minds produce information. We know that intelligence is the only cause we've ever observed capable of generating specified complexity and functional information. So when we find information in DNA, we're inferring the cause that's known to be adequate, not appealing to mystery. If archaeologists found the Rosetta Stone, they wouldn't say, "We don't yet know how erosion patterns can mimic writing, but we'll keep looking for a naturalistic explanation." They'd immediately and rightly conclude, intelligent agency. The information in life is the signature of a mind. And that mind, capable of encoding the instructions for all biological diversity, possessing knowledge of chemistry, molecular biology, and the laws of physics, sounds remarkably like the God that theists have always proposed. But let's not stop there, because there's another phenomenon that resists materialist explanation even more stubbornly: consciousness itself. Chapter 5. The Hard Problem of Consciousness. Close your eyes right now and think of a sunset. You can see the orange and pink hues in your mind's eye. Feel the warmth on your skin. Hear the waves if it's at a beach. Smell the salt air. Now open your eyes. You're experiencing this video. Colors, sounds, understanding, emotions, and most mysteriously, the sense of being someone having these experiences. This is consciousness, and it's simultaneously the most obvious thing in your life and the most mysterious thing in all of science. You cannot doubt your consciousness. Even if you're a brain in a vat, even if you're in the Matrix, even if nothing you perceive is real, one thing remains undeniable: you are conscious. There's something it's like to be you, experiencing the world from your unique first-person perspective. Descartes got this right. I think, therefore I am. Consciousness is the foundation of all knowledge. Here's why neuroscientists call it the hard problem. We can explain brain activity with increasing sophistication. We can map neurons firing, measure neurotransmitters flowing between synapses, scan brain regions lighting up during different tasks. Modern neuroscience has made incredible progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness, the brain states that accompany different experiences. When you see the color red, we can watch the visual cortex activate. When you feel pain, we can observe specific pathways in the brain lighting up. When you make a decision, we can track the neural activity preceding the conscious experience of choice. We're getting incredibly good at mapping the physical substrate of mental experience. But here's the problem that keeps philosophers and neuroscientists up at night. Correlates aren't explanations. Knowing that the visual cortex activates when you see red doesn't explain why there's a subjective experience of redness. Why isn't processing visual information just unconscious computation, like a camera recording light? Why is there something it feels like to be you? The philosopher David Chalmers crystallized this problem in a famous paper. Physical processes give you functions and behaviors, but they don't give you experience. There's an explanatory gap between objective brain states and subjective conscious states that no current scientific theory bridges. Think about it carefully. Everything else in science deals with objective third-person phenomena. We study particles, forces, chemical reactions, biological processes, things we can measure from the outside. We can agree on the data because we're observing the same objective reality. But consciousness is inherently first person. It's the interior dimension of reality, accessible only to the being having the experience. I can measure your brain activity, but I can never directly experience what it's like to be you. I have to take your word for it when you describe your inner experiences. This creates what philosophers call the knowledge argument. Imagine a neuroscientist named Mary who knows everything physical there is to know about color vision, every wavelength, every neural pathway, every brain process. But Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white room and has never actually seen colors. One day, she walks out and sees a red rose for the first time. Does she learn something new? The answer seems obviously yes. She learns what it's like to experience red, the subjective quality of redness. But if physical knowledge were complete, if knowing all the physical facts gave you all the facts, then Mary shouldn't learn anything new. The fact that she does suggests that consciousness involves something beyond the purely physical. Some neuroscientists and philosophers try to escape this by claiming consciousness is just an illusion, an epiphenomenon of brain activity that doesn't really exist. Daniel Dennett famously argued this position. Consciousness, he says, is a user illusion created by the brain, not a genuine phenomenon requiring explanation. But this is philosophically incoherent and actually quite absurd when you think about it. Consciousness is the one thing we can't be wrong about. Even if everything you perceive is an illusion, even if your memories are false, even if your beliefs are mistaken, someone is being fooled. The experience itself is undeniable. To say consciousness is an illusion is to say the illusion is experiencing itself, which just relocates the mystery. As philosopher Galen Strawson puts it, consciousness is the only thing we're absolutely certain exists. We could be wrong about electrons, wrong about the external world, wrong about everything except the immediate fact of experience. Others propose panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, present in some form even in simple particles. Every electron has a tiny bit of proto-consciousness, and complex consciousness emerges when these micro-experiences combine. This is gaining traction among some physicists and philosophers who are frustrated with materialism's failure to explain consciousness. But panpsychism faces its own severe problems, especially the combination problem. How do billions of micro-consciousnesses in atoms combine to create your unified conscious experience? Why doesn't your brain generate billions of separate conscious subjects instead of one integrated you? It's like saying you can build a symphony by putting together atoms of music. Even if each atom had a tiny bit of musical quality, you wouldn't get a coherent symphony. You'd get noise. The unity of consciousness, the fact that you have one integrated experience rather than billions of disconnected experiences, remains unexplained. Materialism, the view that only physical things exist, that everything is just matter and energy following the laws of physics, struggles profoundly with consciousness. If the brain is just neurons firing according to the laws of physics and chemistry, producing consciousness seems like magic. How do electrochemical signals, which we can describe completely in terms of charges, molecules, and ion channels, create the felt quality of pain, the redness of red, the taste of coffee, the feeling of love? There's no obvious bridge from objective neural activity to subjective experience. You can list every physical fact about pain signals, describe the C fibers firing, the neurotransmitters releasing, the brain regions activating, and you still haven't explained why it hurts. The subjective quality, what philosophers call qualia, seems to be something over and above the physical processes. Some scientists are quietly acknowledging that consciousness might be fundamental rather than derivative. Just as matter and energy are basic features of reality that can't be reduced to anything more basic, perhaps the mind is too. Perhaps consciousness isn't something brains produce, like steam from boiling water. Perhaps consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality, and brains are devices that organize and focus consciousness rather than generate it. This is a radical shift, but it's being taken seriously by serious thinkers. The physicist Max Tegmark has explored mathematical theories where consciousness is a fundamental property. Neuroscientist Christoph Koch has moved toward panpsychism. Philosopher Philip Goff has written extensively on why consciousness suggests reality is more than mere matter. This has profound theological implications. If mind is fundamental to reality rather than an accidental byproduct of matter, it suggests that intelligence and consciousness are woven into the fabric of existence itself. It's more consistent with a universe created by a conscious God than a universe that's fundamentally mindless stuff that accidentally generated minds. Think about the logic. If the universe begins as pure matter and energy with no consciousness, how does consciousness emerge? How do you get subjects from objects? How do you get minds from mindless particles? The emergence seems miraculous, something appearing from nothing that contained it. But if consciousness is fundamental, if mind is part of the ground of being, then individual conscious beings like us are not accidents, but reflections of something deeper. We're not glitches in a cosmic computer. We're manifestations of a reality that has mind as a fundamental feature. This fits naturally with theism. If God is a conscious, intelligent being who created the universe, then consciousness is fundamental. It exists at the foundation of reality, and our consciousness is derived from and dependent on the divine consciousness. We're made in the image of God, and that image includes the capacity for conscious experience, rational thought, and self-awareness. Philosopher Thomas Nagel, who is himself an atheist, wrote a book titled Mind and Cosmos: Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. He's not arguing for God, but he's arguing that any worldview that can't account for consciousness as a fundamental feature is incomplete and probably wrong. Nagel concludes that the appearance of consciousness in the universe is not an accident that naturalistic processes can explain. It points to something deeper about the nature of reality itself. Mind is not incidental. It's central. Does consciousness prove God? Not conclusively, but it suggests strongly that reality is more than mere matter and energy. It points toward the mind being basic rather than accidental. And if mind is fundamental, the hypothesis of a cosmic mind, a divine consciousness that grounds all other consciousness, becomes not just plausible, but perhaps explanatory. It makes more sense that a conscious God created a universe that would produce conscious beings than that unconscious matter accidentally stumbled into consciousness. The theistic worldview has a natural place for consciousness. Materialism treats it as an embarrassing anomaly. This leads us to consider whether mathematics itself reveals something transcendent about reality. Chapter 6. The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. Albert Einstein once asked a question that should disturb anyone who thinks deeply about reality. How can it be that mathematics, being after all a product of human thought which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate to the objects of reality? Let me unpack why this question is so profound. Think about what mathematics is. It's a system of abstract logic that humans develop in their minds. Mathematicians sit in offices, working with symbols on paper or chalkboards, proving theorems using pure reason, often without any connection to the physical world. They explore abstract spaces, imagine higher dimensions, invent new number systems, all through thought alone. A mathematician might spend years developing an obscure area of abstract mathematics, working on problems purely for their logical beauty, with no thought to practical application. These are mental constructions, games played with symbols according to logical rules. Yet when physicists want to describe reality, from the smallest subatomic particles to the largest structures in the cosmos, they find that mathematics not only works, but works with shocking, uncanny precision. The universe appears to be written in mathematical language. Physicist Eugene Wigner wrote a famous paper in 1960 titled "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences." He was pointing to a deep mystery. Why should abstract mathematical structures invented by human minds match the deep structure of physical reality so perfectly? This isn't a minor curiosity. It's the foundation of all modern science. Every major advance in physics has come through mathematical description. And here's the spooky part. Often mathematics comes first, developed for purely abstract reasons, and only later do we discover it describes reality. Let me give you examples that will make your head spin. In the 19th century, mathematicians developed non-Euclidean geometry as a purely abstract exercise. For 2,000 years, geometry meant Euclidean geometry, the kind you learned in school with flat planes and parallel lines. Then, mathematicians started asking, what if we change the parallel postulate? What if we allow space to be curved? They developed entire systems of geometry where space could have positive curvature, like the surface of a sphere, or negative curvature, like a saddle. These were considered mathematical curiosities, interesting logical constructions with no connection to reality. After all, space is obviously flat, right? Decades later, Einstein was searching for a mathematical framework to describe gravity in his theory of general relativity. He needed a way to describe how massive objects curve space and time, and there it was, waiting for him. Non-Euclidean geometry, developed by mathematicians who had no idea they were describing the actual structure of space-time. The mathematical tools Einstein needed had been sitting on the shelf for 50 years, invented for completely different reasons. Or consider complex numbers. In the 16th century, mathematicians exploring solutions to equations stumbled upon the square root of -1, which they called I for imaginary. These numbers were considered absurd. How can you have the square root of a negative number? It shouldn't exist. It's not real. But complex numbers turned out to have beautiful mathematical properties, so mathematicians explored them as abstract curiosities. They developed an entire complex plane, studied complex functions, proved theorems about them, all as pure mathematics with no connection to the physical world. Then quantum mechanics arrived in the 20th century, and physicists discovered that the fundamental equations describing quantum reality, the Schrödinger equation, the Dirac equation, require complex numbers, not as a mathematical convenience, but as essential components. Quantum states are represented as complex-valued wave functions. You cannot do quantum mechanics without complex numbers. The imaginary numbers that were invented as abstract impossibilities turned out to describe the deepest levels of physical reality. Reality is literally built on imaginary numbers. Paul Dirac, one of the pioneers of quantum mechanics, provides another stunning example. Dirac was trying to develop an equation that combined quantum mechanics with special relativity. He was guided primarily by mathematical beauty, looking for an equation that was elegant and symmetrical. In 1928, he derived what's now called the Dirac equation. It was mathematically beautiful, but it had a strange feature. It predicted the existence of particles with negative energy. Most physicists thought this was just a mathematical artifact, a quirk of the equation with no physical meaning. But Dirac took mathematics seriously. He predicted that there must exist antiparticles, particles with the same mass as electrons but opposite charge. At the time, no one had ever seen such a thing. The prediction was based purely on mathematical reasoning. 4 years later, in 1932, Carl Anderson discovered the positron, the anti-electron, in cosmic ray experiments. It matched Dirac's mathematical prediction perfectly. Mathematics anticipated reality. An equation written on paper predicted a type of matter that had never been observed, and then that matter was found exactly as described. This happens over and over throughout the history of physics. James Clerk Maxwell unified electricity and magnetism through mathematical equations in the 1860s. His equations predicted electromagnetic waves traveling at the speed of light. He realized that light itself must be an electromagnetic wave. 20 years later, Heinrich Hertz experimentally confirmed the existence of radio waves, exactly as Maxwell's equations predicted. Einstein's general relativity equations predicted black holes, regions where gravity is so strong that not even light can escape. For decades, these were considered mathematical curiosities, probably not real. Now we've photographed black holes and detected gravitational waves from black hole collisions. Mathematics anticipated reality by a century. Mathematics developed for its own sake turns out to describe physical reality with eerie accuracy. The universe seems to be structured according to mathematical principles. Galileo said it first. Mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe. Nature's book is written in the language of mathematics. But why? This is the question that should keep you up at night. If the universe is just a cosmic accident, if it emerged from quantum fluctuations or random processes, why would it follow mathematical laws at all? Why wouldn't it be chaotic, arbitrary, random? Why would mathematical structures we invent in our minds correspond to physical structures in the external world? There are several possible explanations, and each has implications for our question about God. First, pure coincidence. Maybe it's just lucky that mathematics works. Maybe human brains evolved pattern recognition abilities, and we've invented mathematical systems that happen to match some patterns in nature. This is the skeptical position. But given how pervasive and precise mathematical description is across all of physics, this strains credulity. It's not one or two lucky matches. It's the entire enterprise of science that rests on mathematical structure. From quantum mechanics to general relativity, from thermodynamics to cosmology, mathematics provides the framework. The standard model of particle physics is a mathematical structure. The laws of thermodynamics are mathematical. Conservation laws are mathematical. Moreover, mathematics often works at levels far removed from human experience. We evolved to hunt, gather, cooperate, and survive on the African savanna. Why would evolution give us brains capable of understanding quantum field theory, general relativity, or higher dimensional topology? These abstractions provided no survival advantage to our ancestors. A caveman who could calculate eigenvalues wouldn't catch more food or have more offspring. The evolutionary explanation might account for basic pattern recognition, but it doesn't explain why our abstract mathematical reasoning, developed far beyond any evolutionary pressures, matches the deep structure of reality. Second, the universe and minds somehow co-evolved or are both products of deeper laws, so our brains naturally grasp its structure. This is related to the anthropic principle. Perhaps any universe that produces observers must have a mathematical structure that those observers can understand. But this still doesn't explain why the universe is mathematical in the first place, and it doesn't explain the incredible depth of that mathematical structure. We keep discovering deeper levels, more elegant descriptions, more beautiful symmetries. The standard model, quantum field theory, string theory, each level reveals more mathematical sophistication. Third, mathematics reflects the mind of a creator. If the universe was designed by a rational intelligence, it makes perfect sense that it would have a rational mathematical structure. Mathematics is the language of logical thought. A mind that creates through reason would naturally create a rationally structured, mathematically ordered universe. And if humans are made in the image of that intelligence, it explains why our minds can grasp that structure. We're not accidents trying to understand a meaningless universe. We're rational beings created by a rational God, and we can understand the universe because both our minds and the universe itself flow from the same rational source. The mathematician John Lennox puts it this way: the fact that the universe is mathematically structured and our minds can comprehend that structure suggests both come from the same source, a rational creator. It's like recognizing that a book is readable because both the book and the reader come from the same language community. This also explains why mathematics is beautiful. Mathematicians often talk about elegant proofs, beautiful equations, and symmetrical structures. Paul Dirac famously said it's more important for an equation to be beautiful than for it to fit experimental data, because a beautiful equation is more likely to be true. He was right. The most fundamental laws of physics are stunningly beautiful mathematically. But why should mathematics be beautiful? Why should elegance and symmetry be guided to truth? In a random universe, there's no reason to expect beauty. But if the universe is the creation of an intelligent mind, beauty makes sense. Artists create beautiful works. Minds value aesthetics. A divine mind might create according to principles of elegance and beauty. Does mathematics prove God? Not in isolation, but it adds another powerful layer to the cumulative case. We have a finely tuned universe, a beginning that requires a cause beyond the universe, information in life that points to intelligence, consciousness that suggests mind is fundamental, and now mathematical order that reveals rational structure. Each piece alone is suggestive. Together they form a pattern. The universe looks designed, intelligently ordered, purposefully structured. It looks like the product of a mind. But we need to be intellectually honest and address the strongest challenges to belief in God. Because if we're just building a one-sided case, we're not pursuing truth. We're pursuing confirmation of what we already want to believe. Chapter 7. The strongest objections. If we're being intellectually honest, if we really care about truth rather than just winning an argument, we have to confront the most powerful arguments against God's existence. Let's not stack the deck. Let's not pretend these objections are easy to dismiss. Let's face them head-on with the respect they deserve. The problem of evil is the heaviest, the most emotionally and philosophically potent objection to belief in God. And it's personal. It's not abstract. Every person watching this has experienced suffering, has seen loved ones hurt, has asked why bad things happen. Here's the argument in its starkest form. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, why does intense suffering exist? Why do children die of cancer? Why do tsunamis kill hundreds of thousands of people, including infants who've done nothing wrong? Why do genetic diseases torture people from birth? Why is nature red in tooth and claw, filled with predators tearing prey apart, parasites eating hosts from the inside, diseases devastating populations? The logical structure is simple. Either God can prevent evil but chooses not to, which means he's not perfectly good, or God wants to prevent evil but cannot, which means he's not all-powerful, or God doesn't know about evil, which means he's not all-knowing. Or, the simplest explanation, God doesn't exist. This isn't just a logical puzzle. It's existential. When a parent holds their dying child, when someone endures years of chronic pain, when natural disasters destroy entire communities, the question, why, becomes a scream. Any honest theodicy, any attempt to reconcile God's existence with evil, has to acknowledge the crushing weight of suffering. The traditional responses feel inadequate in the face of real horror. Some theologians point to free will, arguing that God gave humans genuine freedom to choose, and that freedom necessarily includes the possibility of choosing evil. Moral goodness requires free choice, and free choice means the possibility of moral evil. But this doesn't address natural evil. The suffering caused by earthquakes, diseases, genetic defects, the laws of nature themselves. A child born with a devastating genetic disorder didn't choose that. A family killed by a tsunami didn't exercise free will in a morally relevant way. Nature's cruelty isn't a product of human choice. Others point to soul-making theodicy, the idea that character, virtue, courage, and compassion require challenges to develop. Without suffering, there's no opportunity for moral growth. This world is a place where souls are formed, where we develop qualities that have eternal value. But the distribution of suffering seems arbitrary and excessive. Why do some people face unimaginable horrors, while others live comfortable lives? Why do children suffer before they're old enough to develop character? Why is so much suffering seemingly pointless, not leading to growth, but just to despair and death? Still others admit mystery and appeal to the limits of human understanding. Perhaps God has morally sufficient reasons that we can't perceive from our limited perspective. Maybe suffering fits into a larger picture we can't see. This is honest, but it's not satisfying. It asks for trust when trust feels impossible. The problem of evil remains the strongest emotional and philosophical barrier to belief in God. It's not a logical disproof. You can logically have an all-powerful, all-good God and evil if God has morally sufficient reasons we can't perceive. But it creates a tension that every believer must wrestle with, and dismissing it too quickly shows a lack of empathy and intellectual honesty. The second major objection is divine hiddenness. If God exists and wants a relationship with humans, if God is loving and desires to be known, why isn't the evidence clearer? Why not appear in the sky undeniably? Why not perform obvious miracles that leave no room for doubt? Why allow genuine seekers, people who honestly want to believe, to search their whole lives and come away empty? The philosopher J.L. Schellenberg has argued this powerfully. If a perfectly loving God exists, that God would ensure a relationship with every person capable of one. But many people, despite sincere seeking, never experience God. They pray, they study, they attend religious services, and they encounter silence. This hiddenness seems inconsistent with a loving Creator who desires to be known. Religious believers respond that overwhelming evidence might eliminate free belief. If God appeared undeniably, if miracles were constant and obvious, belief wouldn't be a free choice. It would be coerced. God remains subtle, providing sufficient evidence for those willing to see, but not so much that belief is forced. Others argue that God does provide sufficient evidence, but human sin, pride, or presuppositions prevent people from seeing it. The evidence is there in creation, in conscience, in religious experience, but people suppress it. As the saying goes, for those who believe, no proof is necessary. For those who don't, no proof is sufficient. And mystical traditions across religions claim that God is found not through intellectual argument, but through personal encounter, prayer, meditation, spiritual practice. God's hiddenness is an invitation to seek deeply, to move beyond surface intellectual games to genuine spiritual transformation. But these responses don't fully satisfy. Why should belief require such effort? Why should God play hide and seek with people's eternal destinies? Why is the evidence ambiguous enough that intelligent, sincere people can look at the same world and reach opposite conclusions? The third major objection comes from evolution. Darwin's theory of natural selection provides a naturalistic explanation for the apparent design in living things. Life wasn't designed by God. It evolved through blind processes, random mutation, and natural selection operating over billions of years. The appearance of purpose is an illusion created by selection pressures. Eyes weren't designed to see. They evolved because seeing provided survival advantages. This is powerful because design was historically the strongest argument for God. William Paley's watchmaker argument said that just as finding a watch implies a watchmaker, finding designed organisms implies a designer. But evolution undermines this. Natural selection can produce complex, apparently designed systems without any designer. Richard Dawkins has argued this forcefully in books like The Blind Watchmaker. Evolution, he claims, removes any need for God in biology. We now have a complete naturalistic explanation for life's diversity and complexity. But this objection has limits. Evolution explains adaptation and diversification of existing life. It doesn't explain the origin of life itself, how the first self-replicating organism arose. It doesn't explain the fine-tuning of the universe that makes life possible. It doesn't explain consciousness or why the laws of physics allow evolution to occur. At best, evolution relocates the design question. Perhaps God designed the evolutionary process itself, setting up laws and initial conditions that would lead to the emergence of life and eventually conscious beings. Theistic evolution is accepted by many religious believers, including scientists. Moreover, even if evolution explains biological complexity without direct divine intervention, it doesn't address the deeper questions. Why does anything exist? Why are the laws of nature structured to allow evolution? Why is there something rather than nothing? The fourth objection is that the God hypothesis explains nothing because it raises more questions than it answers. Who created God? What is God made of? How does a non-physical being interact with physical reality? Where is God located? How does God think without a brain? You've just pushed the mystery back one step and added a bigger mystery. This objection sounds devastating at first, but it misunderstands the nature of the explanation. God, in classical theology, is proposed as the necessary uncaused first cause, a being whose nature is to exist, unlike contingent things which might not exist. God is not one more object in the universe requiring explanation. God is the ground of being itself, the explanation for why there is a universe rather than nothing. Asking who created God commits a category error. The argument is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. God doesn't begin to exist. God is eternal, outside time, necessary rather than contingent. It's like asking what does blue taste like, or what happened before time began. The question applies a category from one domain to something where it doesn't fit. We don't dismiss an explanation just because it doesn't explain itself. If you find footprints on a beach, inferring a person walked there is a good explanation even if you can't then explain where that person came from. The immediate question is answered. You can ask further questions, but that doesn't invalidate the initial explanation. The fifth objection is that religious explanations are unfalsifiable. Any evidence can be interpreted as supporting God or not supporting God. If we find order, it's because God designed it. If we find chaos, it's because of human sin or freedom. If prayers are answered, it's evidence for God. If prayers aren't answered, God works in mysterious ways. The God hypothesis is so flexible that it can accommodate any evidence, which means it predicts nothing, which means it explains nothing. Karl Popper argued that a theory that explains everything explains nothing. A good scientific theory must make specific predictions that could be proven false. If no possible observation could disprove your theory, it's not scientific. But this objection assumes that all meaningful questions must be answerable through the scientific method. Not all important questions are scientific questions. Mathematics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, these aren't empirical domains, but they're real domains of inquiry producing real knowledge. The question of whether God exists might be metaphysical rather than physical. That doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it a different kind of question requiring different methods of investigation. Philosophical reasoning, inference to best explanation, cumulative case arguments, these are legitimate tools even if they're not laboratory experiments. Moreover, theism does make some predictions or expectations. If God exists, we'd expect the universe to be ordered rather than chaotic. We'd expect laws of nature rather than randomness. We'd expect the universe to have a beginning rather than being eternal. We'd expect fine-tuning rather than random constants. We'd expect consciousness and rationality to exist rather than pure mechanisms. These aren't hard predictions in the scientific sense, but they're reasonable expectations that evidence can support or undermine. These objections are serious and deserve respect. They should make believers humble and skeptics thoughtful. The case for God isn't airtight. The case against God isn't definitive either, which means the most honest answer might be more nuanced than either absolute certainty or complete dismissal. But after examining all the evidence, both for and against, where does that leave us? What can we actually conclude? Chapter 8. What the evidence actually shows. So after examining cosmology, fine-tuning, information in life, consciousness, mathematics, and the strongest objections, after looking at this question from every angle we can, where does this leave us? What can we say with intellectual honesty? Here's what we can say with certainty. Science cannot prove God exists in the way it proves gravity or germs exist. God is not an object within the universe that we can detect, measure, experiment on, and replicate results. The divine, by definition, transcends the natural order that science investigates. Science studies causes within nature. God, if God exists, is the cause of nature itself. This isn't a limitation we might overcome with better instruments or more clever experiments. It's inherent to what science is and what God is claimed to be. Science investigates the natural world using natural methods. Supernatural claims fall outside its domain by definition. But here's what's equally true and critically important. Science has not disproven God. Despite confident claims from some corners of new atheism, despite declarations that science has made God unnecessary or obsolete, there's no scientific evidence that makes God's existence impossible or even significantly implausible. In fact, and this is crucial, many modern scientific discoveries have shifted the landscape in ways that make the God hypothesis more intellectually respectable than it was a century ago. Let me explain why this is such a dramatic shift. 100 years ago, the dominant scientific view was that the universe was eternal. No beginning, no end, just endless existence. This was comfortable for atheism because an eternal universe needs no creator. Why invoke God if the universe has always existed? But modern cosmology destroyed that assumption. The universe had a beginning. It's not eternal. The Big Bang is now established beyond reasonable doubt, confirmed by multiple independent lines of evidence. This creates an immediate problem for materialism. What caused the universe to begin? The cause must be outside the universe, outside matter, energy, space, and time. That sounds remarkably like the God that theism has always proposed. 100 years ago, scientists thought the universe was simple. A few fundamental particles, a few forces, simple mechanical laws. There seemed to be nothing special about our existence. We were just one outcome among countless possibilities. But then we discovered fine-tuning. The fundamental constants of nature are calibrated with stunning, almost incomprehensible precision. Change any of dozens of values even slightly, and the universe becomes sterile. No stars, no chemistry, no complexity, no life, nothing. The probability of this happening by chance is so infinitesimally small that it defies comprehension. The main alternative explanation, the multiverse, is itself unfalsifiable metaphysics. It's not science, it's philosophy, and it requires just as much faith as believing in God, perhaps more. You're positing infinite, undetectable universes to avoid the implications of one finely tuned universe. 100 years ago, before we understood molecular biology, life seemed potentially simple at its foundation. Maybe life could arise easily from non-living matter through basic chemical reactions. But modern molecular biology revealed shocking complexity. Life is based on coded information, digital instructions stored in DNA and read by molecular machines. Information, in all our experience, always comes from intelligence. Software requires programmers. The information in even the simplest cell is staggering in its sophistication. Origin of life research, despite decades of effort and billions of dollars, has not produced a plausible naturalistic pathway from chemistry to life. The problem gets harder, not easier, the more we learn. The simplest self-replicating system requires thousands of precisely sequenced base pairs and hundreds of functional proteins working together. The probability of this arising by chance is astronomically small. 100 years ago, consciousness was barely studied scientifically. Now it's recognized as the hard problem, perhaps the hardest problem in all of science. How do unconscious particles following deterministic laws produce subjective experience? Materialism has no answer. It cannot bridge the explanatory gap from objective brain states to subjective conscious states. If consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative, if mind is basic rather than accidental, this points toward a reality where intelligence is woven into the fabric of existence. That's far more consistent with theism than with materialism. 100 years ago, the mathematical structure of reality was less appreciated. Now we see that the universe is deeply, elegantly mathematical. Abstract mathematics, developed purely in human minds, describes physical reality with uncanny precision. This suggests both mind and universe flow from the same rational source. So the cumulative case looks like this. The universe began, requiring a cause beyond itself. The universe is fine-tuned with stunning precision, suggesting intentional calibration. Life is based on information that in all our experience comes from intelligence. Consciousness resists materialist explanation and suggests the mind is fundamental. Mathematics reveals a rational order that our minds can grasp. None of these individually proves God, but together they form what philosophers call a cumulative case. Each piece of evidence makes the God hypothesis more probable than if that evidence didn't exist. The weight of the evidence, while not conclusive, is substantial and growing. Philosopher Richard Swinburne has applied Bayesian probability theory to this question in his book, The Existence of God. He argues that when you add up the probabilities, when you consider all the evidence together, the cumulative probability favors theism over atheism. God's existence provides a better explanation for the totality of what we observe than any purely naturalistic alternative. You might disagree with his specific calculations. You might weigh the evidence differently. But the methodology is sound. We're not looking for absolute proof, which is impossible for metaphysical questions. We're asking, given all the evidence, which worldview has greater explanatory power? Which view makes sense of more data with fewer assumptions? The honest answer is that rational, intelligent, informed people can look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. This depends on their starting assumptions, their assessment of probability, their weighing of competing explanations, and yes, their philosophical and personal inclinations. What we cannot do honestly, what we must not do if we care about intellectual integrity, is claim that science has settled this question. It hasn't. It can't. The question is too big, too fundamental, too wrapped up in issues of meaning, purpose, and metaphysics that lie at the boundary or beyond what empirical science can adjudicate. But science informs the question powerfully. It provides data that any comprehensive worldview must account for. And that data, the beginning of the universe, fine-tuning, biological information, consciousness, mathematical order, leans in a direction. It points, not conclusively but suggestively, toward intelligence, purpose, design, mind. And here's something crucial that we cannot ignore. Whether God exists is not just an academic question. It's not just an interesting puzzle for philosophers and theologians to debate. It's existential. It touches the deepest questions of human existence. If God exists, reality has ultimate meaning and purpose. Your life matters not just to you, not just to the people around you, but cosmically. There's objective moral truth grounded in the nature of God. Justice will ultimately be done, even if it's not done in this life. There's hope beyond death, the possibility of existence continuing in relationship with the infinite. Evil and suffering, while still mysterious and painful, are not the final word. Redemption is possible. Love is not just a chemical reaction, but reflects something fundamental about reality itself. If God doesn't exist, we're accidents in an indifferent cosmos. Our consciousness is a temporary blip, a strange quirk of complex chemistry that will disappear when our brains stop functioning. Our meanings are self-invented, comforting stories we tell ourselves, but ultimately arbitrary. Our morals are subjective preferences, useful for cooperation but not objectively true. Death is the absolute end, the complete cessation of experience and identity. The universe doesn't care about us, and eventually all traces of human existence will vanish into heat death. Now, this doesn't mean atheism leads to despair. Many atheists find beauty, meaning, and purpose in a naturalistic worldview. They create their own values, cherish relationships, pursue knowledge, and appreciate existence despite its brevity. Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and other existentialists wrote movingly about finding meaning in a meaningless universe, about human dignity precisely because we create our own purpose. But it is fundamentally different. The stakes couldn't be higher. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's about what's ultimately real, what matters, what we can hope for. This isn't a decision science makes for you. It's a question you have to wrestle with personally, using all your faculties: reason, intuition, experience, and yes, perhaps even faith. Because faith, properly understood, isn't the opposite of reason. It's not believing without evidence or against evidence. Faith is trust that extends beyond what reason alone can prove, but ideally it's trust that has reasons, trust that's informed by evidence even if the evidence isn't conclusive. C.S. Lewis put it memorably: faith is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. You look at the evidence, you weigh the arguments, you reach a reasoned conclusion. Then faith is continuing to trust that conclusion, even when emotions or circumstances make it difficult. The evidence for God doesn't force a conclusion. You can be a rational atheist. You can look at the same evidence we've discussed and conclude it's not sufficient. You can argue that the problems, evil, hiddenness, the absence of direct evidence, outweigh the positive considerations. That's a defensible position. But you can also be a rational theist. You can look at the fine-tuning, the beginning of the universe, the information in life, consciousness, mathematical order, and conclude that these point toward God. You can argue that the existence of a necessary being makes more sense than an infinite regress or a universe that pops into existence uncaused. That's also a defensible position. What's not defensible is claiming that your position is the only rational one, that everyone who disagrees is stupid or deluded. Both atheism and theism are live options for thoughtful people. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous in the sense that it doesn't compel certainty either way. And maybe that's exactly what we should expect if God exists and values free relationships. If God wanted to force belief, the evidence could be overwhelming. If God wanted to remain completely hidden, the evidence could be absent. But if God wants a relationship based on free response, genuine seeking, trust rather than coercion, then ambiguous evidence makes sense. The philosopher Blaise Pascal called this the divine wager. We're forced to choose, even if we try to remain neutral. Not deciding is itself a decision. And the stakes are infinite. If God exists and we reject that relationship, we lose infinitely. If God exists and we embrace that relationship, we gain infinitely. If God doesn't exist, our choice matters less in ultimate terms. Pascal wasn't saying this proves God exists. He was saying that, given the stakes and the ambiguity of evidence, seeking God makes rational sense. It's not blind faith. It's reasonable trust given incomplete but substantial evidence. The evidence doesn't force a conclusion, but it invites a decision. It opens a door. And each of us has to decide whether to walk through that door or not. Conclusion. So can science prove God? We've journeyed through cosmology, fine-tuning, molecular biology, consciousness, mathematics, objections, and evidence. We've looked at this question from every angle. What's the final answer? The answer is no, if by prove you mean demonstrate with absolute certainty in a laboratory setting, with repeatable experiments that force the conclusion. The nature of the divine transcends empirical measurement. Science studies the natural world, and God, if God exists, is supernatural, the ground of nature itself, rather than an object within nature. But can science inform the question? Absolutely and profoundly. Can scientific discoveries provide evidence consistent with God's existence? Undeniably. Can they make belief in God intellectually credible and rationally defensible? Yes, more now than at almost any time in history. Does science make atheism the only rational position? Not even close. The evidence from modern science, particularly cosmology and physics, has actually strengthened the case for theism in important ways. What we've seen today is that the universe reveals patterns that are more naturally explained by intentional design than by chance or necessity. Fine-tuning with incomprehensible precision, a beginning that demands a cause beyond the universe. Information in life that in all our experience comes from intelligence. Consciousness that suggests mind is fundamental rather than accidental. Mathematical order that reveals rational structure our minds can grasp. These don't prove God beyond all doubt, but they make belief in God intellectually credible, philosophically defensible, and rationally justified. They shift the burden of proof. The universe doesn't look random. It looks calibrated, structured, designed for the emergence of complexity, consciousness, and life. The question of God's existence ultimately requires integrating science with philosophy, metaphysics, personal experience, and yes, a degree of faith. Not blind faith that ignores evidence, but informed faith that trusts a conclusion that seems most coherent with the total evidence, even while acknowledging uncertainty. The famous philosopher Antony Flew spent decades as one of the world's most prominent atheists, debating Christians, writing books attacking religious belief. Then, late in life, he changed his mind. Not because of religious experience or emotional reasons, but because of the evidence from modern science. The origin of life, with its complex coded information, the fine-tuning of nature with its stunning precision, the existence of the laws of nature themselves, which he argued point toward a divine lawgiver. Flew concluded, to the shock of the atheist community, that the evidence pointed toward an intelligent source, a cosmic intelligence he called God. He didn't become a Christian. He remained critical of organized religion. But he moved from atheism to deism, belief in a creator God, based purely on following the evidence where it led. His intellectual honesty demanded that he acknowledge what the evidence suggested, even though it contradicted his lifelong position. You might reach a different conclusion than Flew. That's your right and your responsibility. But approach it honestly. Don't let either scientism, the belief that science is the only path to knowledge and the only questions worth asking are scientific questions, or fideism, belief without any regard for evidence or reason, shape your conclusion. Look at the evidence with open eyes. Weigh the arguments fairly. Consider the objections seriously. Acknowledge what you don't know. And be humble enough to admit that on the biggest questions of existence, absolute certainty might be beyond any of us. The universe is far stranger, more wonderful, more mysterious, and more awe-inspiring than either crude materialism or simplistic religion suggests. The cosmos is filled with mathematical beauty, elegant laws, staggering complexity, conscious minds that can contemplate their own existence and the existence of the cosmos itself. Maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what we should expect if reality is more than atoms and void, if there's meaning woven into the fabric of things, if there's purpose embedded in the structure of reality. If there's a mind behind it all, a creative intelligence that brought the universe into existence, fine-tuned it for life, embedded information in biology, made minds possible, and structured it all according to rational mathematical principles that our minds can discover and understand, the evidence points in a direction, not with certainty, but with weight, not with proof, but with probability. Not closing the question, but opening it, inviting us to consider seriously what we might otherwise dismiss. And that invitation is the first step toward truth. Because the truth, if we really care about it, doesn't come to those who've already decided. It comes to those who are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if that's somewhere they didn't expect to go. If this video challenged you, if it made you think, if it raised questions you hadn't considered, or if it frustrated you because you disagree with some of what I've said, good. That means you're engaging seriously with the most important question you can possibly ask. Does God exist? Is there meaning and purpose to reality, or are we alone in an indifferent universe? I want to hear from you in the comments below. This isn't just me lecturing. This is a conversation, and your perspective matters. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think the evidence points toward God, away from God, or leaves the question genuinely open? What's the strongest argument you've heard on either side? What did I miss? What did I get wrong? What objection do you have that I didn't address? And let's keep this conversation respectful and thoughtful. Both atheists and theists have smart, educated people on their side. Both positions deserve to be taken seriously. Let's not descend into name-calling or dismissiveness. Let's actually engage with the arguments, weigh the evidence, and challenge each other to think more clearly. If you appreciate this kind of deep-dive content, where we don't shy away from hard questions, where we look at arguments from all sides, where we're more interested in truth than in winning debates, then hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You'll be joining a community here at Logic Over Spirit, where reason and belief can dialogue without either side claiming premature victory. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Maybe that's a skeptic who thinks science has definitively disproven God, who needs to understand that the evidence is more complex and more interesting than pop atheism suggests. Or maybe it's a believer who's afraid to let science inform their faith, who needs to see that evidence and reason can actually strengthen belief rather than undermine it. This conversation matters. It's not just academic philosophy. It's about ultimate reality, about meaning, about hope, about what we can trust and why. These questions have shaped civilizations, driven human thought for millennia, and continue to matter profoundly today. Next week, we're diving deeper into the problem of evil. Not running from it, not offering easy answers, but facing it head-on with intellectual honesty. If God exists, why is there so much suffering? Why do innocent people experience horrific pain? What are the best attempts to reconcile divine goodness with earthly evil? And are they sufficient? You won't want to miss that discussion. Until then, keep questioning, keep seeking, keep thinking deeply about what matters most. Remember, the truth isn't afraid of investigation. Real truth can withstand scrutiny, welcomes challenges, and emerges stronger from honest inquiry. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking. Thank you for being part of this journey toward truth. I'll see you in the next one.